we're now going to shift gears in kind of a major way. So we've met the executive branch again for now focusing with the parts closest to the president. Before we leave this to go look at the bureaucracy, we're going to look at presidential power over time. And we need to understand that presidents have always claimed some important powers. And as we get into this, the first thing we should talk about is kind of an implied source of presidential power. And this is the ordinance power. And typically, when we see the word ordinance in this context, you're often going to see these as kind of what we call laws at the city level. So you might see that somebody is in violation of ordinance such and such. Maybe they haven't been keeping their yard properly mowed, or they've got broken down vehicles set in their front yard. And the idea here is similar. I mean, ordinance is the power to make binding rules. In this case, that have the force of law. We've seen those a bit with executive orders, and hence they come back in here. Remember, presidents use executive orders to do things like direct the bureaucracies the president oversees, but we've also seen them use executive orders for things like changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America for at least the purposes of American naming of things. These are also can be contested. One of these, for example, is Washington and his assertions. I mean, this executive privilege goes way back to the beginning. And executive privilege is the idea that in order to have separation of powers and independent co-equal branches, the executive branch needs to be able to keep its own dealings private from the other branches, or confidential from the other branches. This is where the contestation comes in. What things count as communications or documents or other things that the executive branch can rightly withhold from the other two branches. And so sometimes, when this comes up is when there are accusations that executive privilege is being invoked as a way to cover up errors or even misdeeds within the executive branch. And again, it is a presidential power that has some recognition and some support, and certainly has been used by presidents over time in order to keep the workings of their branch and their communications confidential from the other branches or from the public. As we talk about presidential power over time, right now presidential power appears to be in the ascendant. The executive branch in a lot of ways looks like it may be in some ways working towards becoming the paramount branch of government. But this has not always been the case, and nothing about current trends makes an end point inevitable. Early presidents mostly followed what is referred to as Whig theory. And according to Whig theory, Congress takes the lead. So they make the policy, they appropriate the funds, and the president stays in their lane. They use only in a narrowly defined way the expressed powers for the executive branch. They execute the laws passed by Congress. There were exceptions early on. Andrew Jackson, I mean, it's from this early political cartoon, King Andrew I, using his veto power. Of course, I mean, in this case, looking back with hindsight, talk about King Andrew I, right? Andrew Jackson kind of has nothing on later presidents in terms of interpreting their powers and exercising their powers in a broader fashion. Abraham Lincoln, we can have a more clear case with the Emancipation Proclamation, which is issued as an executive order with, at least in theory, huge implications for the freedom of slaves in America. Of course, remember those. We talk about this. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to enslaved people living in the Confederate States of America, not enslaved people who were living in Union territory, places like Missouri, which was a slave state but which did not secede. We also have actions by Abraham Lincoln like the suspension of habeas corpus. So there are potential exceptions within Whig theory, but early presidents mostly followed the idea that Congress leads and the president executes policies set by Congress. Where we start to see a big shift is when we get into the so-called progressive era. Here we switch to a different theory, stewardship theory. And this very much kind of turns Whig theory upside down. And here we can see it very clearly. Presidents should have the power to do anything except those things expressly prohibited in the Constitution. So Whig theory, presidents do what is expressly permitted for them to do. Stewardship theory, presidents do anything except what is expressly prohibited for them to do. And so we have the two Roosevelts as some of our most prominent examples of early stewardship theory presidents, TR, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. And then, past that, in the 1950s, 1960s, we have what is called the imperial presidency, where presidents seem to become very powerful in terms of what they do. And a lot of this focuses on policies during the Korean War, especially during the Vietnam War, the actions of Lyndon Johnson and the escalation of that conflict, but also domestically. President in that time period also seemed to be taking the executive branch into ascendancy. But after that point, presidential power went into decline. In the 1970s, some of this was a reaction. And what Johnson did in the 1960s, Nixon's acts in the 1970s, the Plumbers, Watergate, bombing in Cambodia, his actions discredited executive power and to some extent the executive branch. Okay? But again, Nixon's not alone in this. Right? Johnson was also seen as having taken presidential power too far. But it is Nixon, who really adds the discredit not just to presidential power, which we can kind of lay at the feet of LBJ and Nixon, but also in the case of Nixon, discrediting the office of the president. And from there, we get efforts to rein in the power of the president. And some of this also is, as we're going to see, comes into the presidents that followed those two people. It's not just a reaction. But what we see initially are efforts explicitly to pull back power to Congress away from the executive branch. And that's where we get the War Powers Act of 1973 that we've talked about before. This gives Congress, it's called a legislative veto. And we've talked about that before. In this case, it is different from other aspects of legislative veto. In this case, what Congress is saying is it's using its power to declare war and create armed forces to block executive use of those armed forces if Congress feels that the executive branch has exceeded its authority. The other thing to understand, remember, this was vetoed by Nixon and overridden, though these are different vetoes. In this case, legislative veto, again, means that it is the legislative branch that is vetoing an executive action. And so do be careful with that in your notes. This is the one time the veto does not mean the executive branch trying to block an act of Congress. It's the other way around. We have the Impoundment Act of 1974, and this is meant to force the executive branch to spend money for policy as Congress has appropriated those funds through budget legislation. Because one of the things that has happened, and Nixon was not the first to do this, but presidents who did not like the policies coming out of Congress, they might sign the budget into law, but then to get around the parts they didn't like, they would just not spend the money as Congress had appropriated. They would just sit on it. We also see the judicial branch get in here as well. We have the Supreme Court case Train versus City of New York. And what this is actually about, I know it does not look like it might be a case involving the executive branch, but there was grant money that Congress had appropriated that the executive branch was supposed to distribute at the regional and local level for particular purposes. And in this case, the executive branch the president was not allowing those funds to be dispersed. And the Supreme Court said, look, if Congress writes the law that money up to this level is supposed to be distributed, that does not give the executive branch authority to sit on those funds. They can't distribute more than what Congress appropriated, but they have to distribute the grant funding that Congress has appropriated for those purposes. I know none of that is exciting sounding, but it was an important pushback from the judicial branch that kind of also went hand in hand with what Congress did through the Impoundment Act of 1974. And from that period, we enter what's referred to as the era of weak presidents, 1974 to 2001. Ford and Carter are the poster boys of this. Poor Gerald Ford, he's the only president we have who was never elected either vice president or president. He's picking up right after Nixon's scandals. He, as he sees it, for the good of the country, pardons Nixon so that we can move past that, and it's very unpopular. He also has some quite literal stumbles, falling down the stairs of Air Force One. Lots of these things just do not go well for his image. And he also faces, when he runs against Carter for president, he's undermined by the candidacy of Ronald Reagan. And then we get Carter. And Carter also, and a lot of this is image problems, but also policy failures. The Iranian Revolution happens on Carter's watch. Carter orders a military operation to try to rescue the hostages. It ends in disaster in the desert. Lives are lost and no hostages are freed. Carter also has the misfortune in hindsight of doing things like wearing cardigans, which were seen as weak. Now, you guys know me, those of you who have at least seen me in class, I'm a cardigan man, so I will not hold cardigans against Carter. But part of the reason he was wearing cardigans is this was also the era of energy crises you probably learned about, I hope, in U.S. history, and he was encouraging Americans to economize. And save money when you're cold. Instead of turning the thermostat up and burning more gas or using more electricity, put on a sweater, which in a lot of ways, good solid advice. That is certainly what my grandfather would have told you. And he was a depression kid. Right? You saved money. You didn't heat up the whole dang house. You put on a sweater so you could be warm. But this is not typically what Americans like to hear. Americans like to hear, right, be comfortable, right? Drive your cars, go places, drive fast. Carter also is tied to the policy of lowering interstate highway speed limits to 55 miles an hour, which infuriated a lot of people. There's even a classic rock song. I'm trying to remember which one. I say it's Van Halen. Doesn't matter. It's I Can't Drive 55. And a lot of this just works against the presidents. If Ford and Carter are the poster children of the weak presidency, this even applies to people we think of as successful, powerful presidents like Reagan and Clinton. They were still in lots of ways restrained by Congress. Some argue that Clinton's presidency is seen as such a success because of the compromises he had to make with Congress controlled by Republicans after the so-called Republican Revolution of 1994. But now, right, the discussion in the 21st century is around the question of whether we are returning to an imperial presidency. And a lot of this kicks off, of course, with our first fully 21st century president, George W. Bush. And here is where we get the introduction of unitary executive theory. It wasn't invented in the George W. Bush administration, but his administration included quite a few people who were big supporters and some of the legal theorists behind current unitary executive theory. And this is the idea that the president should have complete control of the executive branch without interference from Congress in terms of how the executive branch is run. This leads to things like signing statements in George W. Bush's administration, where he might sign a bill into law, but he follows that with a signing statement that says the executive branch interprets this such and such a way that actually might undermine the intent and letter of the law that he has just signed. And that was kind of seen as a pushback against Congress, right, to give him leeway to not enforce the law, perhaps as Congress would have wanted. We also see this with the Obama administration, use of executive privilege. There was a Fast and Furious, became known as the Fast and Furious scandal. It was because there was a law enforcement operation called Fast and Furious where illegally purchased arms were allowed to enter Mexico. They ended up being used by cartels in violence to kill people in Mexico. The goal had been to figure out what are the networks for moving these guns, but of course it did not work well. And in order to, depending on where you were in this, your view of this scandal, perhaps to keep the scandal under wraps, the Obama administration invoked executive privilege to keep some of those internal documents and internal conversations out of the eyes of Congress and the public. Obama also was known for his use of recess appointments. A Republican-controlled Senate was blocking his appointments for a variety of positions. Presidents do have the power to make appointments when Congress is in recess. The idea is if there's an absence in an office, we need to fill it, and it can be important to do that even if Congress isn't around, and Congress used to take longer recesses, and so the idea was presidents could appoint someone temporarily. That person could only stay in the job until Congress had a chance to come back into session and make a decision, at which point that person would have to stand for confirmation. Obama used these a lot, and this ended up going to the case of National Labor Relations Board versus Canning. The case of NLRB versus Canning, so this kind of takes us fairly deep into the weeds and lots of minute details. I will try to keep it as much to the surface as I possibly can. The essence of this case is the National Labor Relations Board made a decision, and the National Labor Relations Board, we've met previously, that is one of these independent regulatory commissions, and the board made a decision against Canning. Canning sued on the grounds that one of the members of the board had been appointed during what President Obama's administration called a recess of the Senate. Canning's side argued that during this time period that the Obama administration claimed the Senate was in recess, there were actually meetings of the Senate occurring, and they were just pro forma sessions, which means they were just kind of going through the motions of having a session, and they were doing this about every 3 days. And Canning's side argued that because the Senate was meeting roughly every 3 days, even if it's not a normal meeting of the Senate where business is conducted, the Senate was still meeting and had the means to conduct business as necessary. And so President Obama was not correct in claiming that he was able to appoint people during these time periods because the Senate wasn't really in recess. Now, just in the situation of this, you can see that there was conflict between the Obama administration and the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate, regarding his appointments. And the Republicans wanted to block those appointments. Obama was trying to find a creative way to put people in those positions around Senate blocking. What the Supreme Court said was that a recess, whether it was between active sessions of Congress or a recess that was called during a normal session of Congress or session of the Senate, what mattered most was the number of days that meetings of senators were not happening. And based on kind of historical precedent, the Supreme Court set the threshold at 10 days, which lines up also nicely with the kind of the 10-day period regarding whether a bill becomes law without the president's signature or suffers a pocket veto. So 10 days is again the standard. If there are meetings of the Senate more frequently than every 10 days, even if they're just pro forma meetings, the president cannot make recess appointments during those time periods. So there was some pushback there. But the point for us in terms of the return of the imperial presidency is that President Obama was asserting that Congress is in recess and asserting that he had the authority to make these appointments. And in this case, the Supreme Court pushed back. So I'm sorry, I know that is not a very exciting case, and it definitely gets into the weeds of politics and the law and precedent. So the next thing we will move on to is more exciting. Unfortunately, the reason it's more exciting is not a particularly good thing, and that is the instances, or in this case, there's a particular, very visible instance of extrajudicial killing at the orders of President Obama's administration. The specific case that got the most attention was the killing by drone strike a man who was born in New Mexico and therefore a citizen of the United States. His name was Anwar al-Awlaki. He was accused of being a leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And there was a lot of evidence to suggest that he was, in fact, an operational leader in al-Qaeda. That part is not the issue. The issue that makes it extrajudicial killing is President Obama very much directly was involved in the group that made the decision to kill Awlaki by drone strike. And this was done via a drone strike, I believe, on a vehicle he was in, and he was killed. And at this point, some of you may be asking, okay, so then what's the problem? I mean, we have a likely terrorist who is taken out by drone strike. That certainly is not an uncommon event during the War on Terror, especially at its height. The issue here is that this was an American citizen, and what some legal scholars and lawyers have argued is the president essentially ordered his execution as a criminal punishment, and yet this was an American citizen who was not deprived of his life without due process of law. The decision to condemn him as guilty of terrorism, and I suppose other crimes probably lumped in there, and the decision to punish him by death was done completely within the executive branch. Matter of fact, it was a small group within the executive branch. President Obama was routinely present for these meetings. And the meetings they happened with enough frequency, they became known as the Terror Tuesday or Targeting Tuesday meetings. And the president would personally approve targets of these drone strikes. But again, what makes this different is that the drone strike was on an American citizen who was killed without due process. And so there's been a lot of discussion of this. One of the defenses from the Obama administration is that due process does not necessarily have to be judicial process. And their argument is the deliberations in the executive branch constitute the due process that was provided to al-Awlaki before he was killed. So again, I know that it can be easy to get lost in the details of this. But again, pull back to the big picture, and what we have are new or at least expanded views of executive branch power. In this case, perhaps intruding into the judicial branch power of trying people accused of crimes. And that brings us to Donald Trump, who, of course, has had one administration and is in a second administration. And here, one of the first things to talk about is the use of executive orders. The list here is quite long. Some of them have gotten a lot of attention. The renaming of the Gulf of America, or the Gulf of Mexico, as the Gulf of America, something we've already talked about. Referring to the Department of Defense as the Department of War, which, remember, the Department of Defense is the name assigned to it by Congress. In addition to those very high-profile executive orders that got a lot of attention, we have a variety of others. Executive orders dealing with detaining and deporting people, sometimes people who were here with legal status but were involved in demonstrations or made public speech contrary to the policy of the administration, such as pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli speech on college campuses. Executive orders that have targeted law firms that had been involved in legal actions against Trump administration officials from the first administration, for example, and denying them security clearances, which basically means these law firms that have long histories of taking cases for the government, which depends on access to sensitive materials, are no longer able to be involved in the kinds of cases that have been the bread and butter of those law firms. And also the executive orders that did things like essentially shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in order for it to cease all of its functions. So we have, and the use of large numbers of executive orders is not new for presidents of the United States. To some extent, what makes Trump's qualitatively different is just the extent to which they push the bounds of legal authority. And here again, famous examples or more noted examples like changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. That pushes up against Congress's authority in creating and laying out departments, even if it just at this point it's kind of a superficial change in the name. And we could talk about executive orders in a lot more detail. One of the things, though, in terms of how they fit into the imperial presidency, is executive orders are a lot like executive agreements. One president can make an executive order that does one thing, the next president can come in and make an executive order that undoes that thing and does something completely different. And so in terms of being an imperial presidency, we can now have very dramatic policy swings as a result of contradictory executive orders from one administration to the other. And as executive orders perhaps become more powerful or have broader implications for their consequences, those swings really can be dramatic. It's easy for presidents to come in and undo what their predecessors have done through executive orders. The issue now is if the executive orders are far more potent in terms of their effects, those policy swings will be much more noticeable to the American people and in some cases to people around the world. And then there's also the question of Doge. This is not the first time I've made this recording where Doge was here with a question mark, had a question mark from the very beginning, partly because its status was kind of unclear as a department in terms of what it could do, and really, to some extent, what it actually was. And Doge is now defunct, okay? But the idea that you could create this department that would be able to go in and undertake mass firings of bureaucrats, among other things. This was kind of a new flexing of presidential muscle within the executive branch and sometimes perhaps encroaching on congressional authority. Adjourning Congress. There's also been some discussion of whether the president could adjourn Congress, which means send them into recess. And this itself is also, I don't know, you're thinking lots of these have been complicated and messy, and from a student's perspective, not all that interesting. I do want to be clear. The president does have constitutional authority to adjourn Congress in Article 2, Section 3, but it refers to an authority to adjourn Congress when the House and the Senate are not able to agree on when they should adjourn. What has become something talked about within the Trump administration is adjourning Congress so that it is out of session and would open up the possibility for Donald Trump to make recess appointments that would not be approved through the Senate confirmation process. And that would be an expansion of presidential power. Obama wanted to call things recesses that the Supreme Court said were not recesses. In this case, it would be the president not only saying what a recess is, but imposing that recess upon Congress in order to make recess appointments. Another question that continues to rise is the extent to which the Trump administration might defy judicial orders. To this point, it remains an open question, at least in terms of the law, as to whether the Trump administration has defied judicial orders. Depending on the person you might ask, he has defied judicial orders about releasing people from federal custody, a variety of things. And so, again, some of this is open questions. That's why there's question marks behind these things. There's also the question of whether unitary executive theory is really coming back in a very big way. A lot of the arguments that Trump administration officials and their supporters are making draw on that same unitary executive theory. That the executive branch, in order for it to be an independent and co-equal branch, the president must have total control of that branch. If there are parts of that branch that the president is not able to control, then the president is not able to fully exercise their constitutional powers. So I've thrown a lot at you there. And some of these terms you definitely will need to know: unitary executive theory, signing statements, executive privilege, recess appointments, understanding the decision, especially the implications of National Labor Relations Board versus Canning, is something you should know. Extrajudicial killing, executive orders. You've got them before, you've got them defined, but understand, right, what we talked about in terms of the potential implications of dramatic policy swings that have more serious consequences than they might have in the past. And now let's talk about some limits. Because, as I said, there is nothing that makes the ascendancy of the executive branch inevitable. It has been ascendant before with the imperial presidency in the 1950s and 1960s. And then we had a period of weak presidents for much of the 1970s through the end of the Clinton administration. So what we're going to consider next are things that might be limits on the current executive ascendancy. One thing to understand, some of these are not going to be new or novel things. There is the notion of the honeymoon period. This is the first 100 days when a president can come in, especially if they have had a popular vote win, a large electoral college margin of victory, and Donald Trump had both of those things, and other presidents have had too. And they claim that they have an electoral mandate. That would be something to write down as part of this honeymoon period, is the electoral mandate. If the president has had large coattails and is able to have a unified government where the president's party controls both houses of Congress, and of course the president's party also controls the presidency, you have a period where the executive branch has a lot of room to move and pass through and implement the policy goals of that administration. This honeymoon period is sometimes referred to as the first 100 days. I believe that expression goes back at least to Franklin Roosevelt, and certainly was talked about in Roosevelt's first presidential term. And the idea here is that presidents need to capitalize on their mandate and any other political advantages they have as quickly as possible, because the longer the president is in office, the greater the likelihood that their popularity is going to decline. When the president's popularity declines, as we will see, sometimes get less support from Congress, and certainly after midterms, when the president's party typically loses seats in Congress, the ability of the president to enact their policy goals is diminished. So just time is a limitation on presidents. There's also, built up in this broader concept of the public presidency, the importance of public opinion. The president does have the bully pulpit, so they have an ability to get their message out there and perhaps shape public opinion more than any other federal elected official. At the same time, the president really needs that bully pulpit, because public opinion, especially presidential approval, which is measured almost constantly through polling, public opinion and presidential approval are important. As I hinted at with the honeymoon period, congressional support is closely tied in many cases to public opinion. If a president becomes more and more unpopular, their approval ratings go down. Members of Congress who previously felt that they could not go against the president now feel like they have more latitude to oppose what the president wants, or at least not to enthusiastically support it. As we talk about this, I also want to be clear, I'm not just talking about members of the other party, right, who are members of the party that is not the president's party. This also applies to co-partisans. And we see a lot of times in that honeymoon period, and it's very much it's something that we see in the Trump administration. Co-partisans have been very reluctant to even speak contrary to the policy goals, policy positions of the Trump administration. You've had a few outspoken critics, Rand Paul, Tom Tillis of North Carolina. But if public opinion turns against the president, you will see that even some of those co-partisans will feel that they have more room to take an independent position and perhaps go against the president on at least some issues. There's also limitation of the press. The press certainly can influence public opinion. It might arguably be that the press has less influence today than it did in the past because of the rise of social media and where people get their news, with far and far larger numbers getting their news from places like TikTok, which, in one of my rare cases where I will tell you my opinion, is horrifying to me. But the press does still have power to influence public opinion. Oddly enough, that power may increase again in the age of AI because it will be harder and harder for people to trust what is real or is not real. In the day, I believe it was just the day before I made this recording, there were news stories about images of Jeffrey Epstein and the current mayor of New York when the current mayor of New York was just a child. And another of those pictures that was released, you have Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Bill Clinton and I think some other people all together. And it turns out those photos were very clearly made by artificial intelligence. They even had the watermarks to indicate that they were made by artificial intelligence, but they were spread widely through social media and a lot of people believed them. As things like that happen, there is the possibility that the more traditional press, what some people sometimes refer to as the legacy media, television, print news, they may actually become more influential because people will feel that they have no other alternative but to return to those older media organizations for more reliable information. Sorry, I know that was kind of a sidetrack from where I was going. Let's return kind of the main thrust of this. The press can influence public opinion. And one of the examples from this is admittedly more than 3 decades old now. Matter of fact, this was the date of publication. What we're actually talking about are events in the very early 1990s, where George H.W. Bush, so not George W. Bush, the first Bush president, one of the things that happened during his one and only term is a recession. So the economy went into negative growth. And that was bad. That presidents never want recessions. Presidents always get the credit for good economies and the blame for bad economies, even though that's not really fair in most cases. For Bush 41, he was up against something particularly difficult. Even as the economy improved, the news media continued to highlight negative economic news about the recession. And so a lot of American voters, they were going to decide between Bush 41 getting a second term or Bill Clinton getting his first term, had these kind of distorted perceptions of the health of the economy because of newspaper, not just newspaper, but media coverage. What the study by Blood and Phillips in 1995 found is that in this case, when Bush's popularity would be increasing, some media outlets with a lot of influence were more likely to report negative economic news. So in this case, you had media perhaps acting in a partisan way to undermine opinion of Bush 41. I don't believe the authors actually go to make that connection of intent for the media, but what they did find was, for whatever reason, there was this correlation between increases in Bush 41's approval ratings and followed by an increase in negative economic reporting from at least some of those media outlets. And by some accounts, that media coverage did a lot to cost Bush 41 re-election. There are also some limiting effects perhaps from financial markets. One of these, and this applies very specifically, as we'll see, to the Trump administration. And again, none of this is to pick on the Trump administration. If it ends up taking up a lot of time in this lecture, some of it is because we're talking about recent trends in presidential power, and also a lot of these examples are topical and easier for students to kind of relate to. So I just want to be clear about that. The taco trade is this idea that is in a lot of financial reporting, not in a political way, but just in terms of financial trends in investing, something called the taco trade. And the taco stands for Trump always chickens out. And the idea here is that when Donald Trump imposes a new tariff or something else or for example, threats to somehow cap credit card interest rates at 10%, that the market will go down. And a lot of investors, following this Trump always chickens out mantra, will do what's called buying the dip. When the prices for stocks go down, they will buy them on the assumption that Donald Trump, seeing the stocks go down, will be afraid of being blamed for a bad stock market, and he'll back off the policy. That's the chickening out part, and the stock prices will go back up. And in terms of how does that have anything to do with a limit on Donald Trump, well, it's simply the idea that Donald Trump is very sensitive to what is happening in the markets. And so if something he does has negative effects on the markets, there's only so much of that he will tolerate before he changes policy away from where he was going in some other direction, which implies that there is a limit on what he can do, right? Because he will not tolerate a lot of negative effects on financial markets. Then, of course, there are the bond vigilantes. I put a question mark here because there's some debate as to whether the phenomenon of bond vigilantes is real. But the idea here is, and it does not just apply to presidents of the United States. One of the best examples that people who argue that bond vigilantes are real and they really matter comes from Britain. And we won't go into that because that is an example from Britain. But the idea here is when presidents, or it could be our federal government as a whole, when they do something that looks like it could undermine the economic or fiscal health of the country, such as lots of deficit spending because of tax cuts going along with increases in, say, defense spending or social spending, that these bond vigilantes will look at this, they will see it as a negative development, and they will, in order to try to get the president or the federal government to reverse course, they will sell a lot of U.S. bonds that they hold. And U.S. bonds that's the way U.S. debt is packaged. Okay, so money that the federal government owes, that it borrows, right? It borrows in the form of selling bonds. And if these bond vigilantes, right, if they are real, right, and if they're really doing this as a way to try and steer, in this case, since our focus is on the president, let's just say steer presidential policy. If they sell lots and lots of bonds all at once, it's kind of the supply and demand stuff that you already know about. If the supply of bonds out there to be bought goes up, the price of them will go down. And that can be harmful to the federal government. Okay, because it needs higher bond prices to borrow it in a more favorable way. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid some of this gets pretty technical. And so they will do that to punish the government for fiscal policies or economic policies that the bond vigilantes see as bad. And so that can be a limit on presidential power, because the president wants to avoid causing a crisis of confidence in U.S. public debt or even the dollar in general, and so we'll still steer clear of extreme policies that might upset people who hold a lot of U.S. bonds. And And then there is also the legislative veto. I know this kind of feels like a but wait, there's more infomercial, and it kind of is like that. And here again, question mark. The theory of the legislative veto is that if you have bicameral majorities, they could vote to cancel out or nullify an executive branch regulation or, say, an executive order. Stop the executive branch from doing something. The question is whether that is constitutional. Generally, the answer is this is already decided. It isn't. In Immigration and Naturalization Services versus Chadha in 1983, the idea of a legislative veto was shot down. Because what this implies is that Congress can, through an act of legislation that the president does not get the opportunity to veto, Congress can stop the executive branch from acting. And so the Supreme Court ruled that that infringes on our system of separation of powers and checks and balances if the legislative branch can unilaterally stop the executive branch from doing something. However, but the idea that a War Powers Act legislative veto would be held up as constitutional is not entirely clear. United States versus the Curtiss-Wright Export Corporation, going back to 1936 and the lead up to World War II. We won't go into the details of this, but the important upshot is that the Supreme Court recognized executive branch preeminence in foreign policy. Not that Congress could have no role, but the executive branch had tremendous latitude to operate in conducting the foreign policy of the United States. So that casts some doubt on the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, or at least how it would be held up by a Supreme Court, especially the Supreme Court that we currently have that seems to be much more of a mind that executive power is expansive, with support for some of the ideas of unitary executive theory. On the other hand, there is, of course, good old Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress, clearly, and only Congress, the power to declare war. According to the textbook that might be used for this class, sorry, to get ahead of ourselves, the authors argue that the Supreme Court would likely uphold a legislative veto exercised through the War Powers Act, and again, only in terms of foreign military operations. So what we have just concluded is a rather complicated look, especially in the final two slides, of the expansion of presidential power, executive power in the 21st century, with some possible limits on that power. And again, a lot of this, I do want to be very clear, is up in the air and directions are uncertain. So please keep that in mind as you're considering this information. And again, understand that as we look at the 21st century presidency, none of what I'm providing to you should be used to infer my own political views. So, anyway, just with that disclaimer. All right, that's where we will conclude. When we come back, we will be looking at the bureaucracy.